Protecting Workers' Civil Rights in the Digital Age. I note for the subcommittee that Congressman Mark Takano of California, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington, Congresswoman Lori Trahan of Massachusetts, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke of New York, and Congresswoman Lisa Brent Rochester of Delaware will be permitted to participate in today's hearing with the understanding that their questions will come only after all members of this subcommittee and then the full committee on both sides of the aisle who are present have had an opportunity to question the witnesses. We'll now move to opening statements. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement. Technology and automation have become entrenched in nearly every aspect of our society and culture. The intentions behind the use of technology may be noble, but our efforts to both assess and address the effects on our workplace have been inadequate. In recent years, employers have harnessed new digital tools like recruiting and hiring algorithms, computer-analyzed video interviews, and real-time tracking of their workers to cut the cost of hiring and managing workers. This is our third hearing in our Future of Work series, and today we'll examine how the technologies that employers use for hiring and management may, intentionally or not, facilitate discrimination and undermine workers' civil rights. We will discuss how Congress, federal agencies, and the business community can strengthen workplace protections to make sure workers are not left vulnerable to discriminatory practices. And to prevent discriminatory hiring, firing, and monitoring practices, we will investigate whether new technologies are designed to account for implicit and explicit bias and are used transparently. Proponents of new technologies assert that digital tools eliminate bias and discrimination by attempting to remove humans from the process. But technology is not developed or used in a vacuum. A growing body of evidence suggests that, left unchecked, digital tools can absorb and replicate systemic biases that are ingrained in the environment in which they are designed. For example, hiring algorithms often rely on correlations to make predictions about the capabilities of job candidates. Yet these tools can mistake correlation for causation and subsequently perpetrate harmful disparities. In 2017, an algorithm built by Amazon to hire engineers was scrapped after it was found to favor men over women by penalizing graduates of women's colleges. Because men hold the majority of engineering positions, the algorithm had presumed that being male was a key characteristic of successful engineers, when in reality, being male does not cause one to be a successful engineer. New technologies that surveil and monitor workers can also exacerbate bias in the workplace. These tools may force workers to share their location, activities, and even private biometric information, sometimes without workers' knowledge or consent. The technologies also allow employers to access private information that could be used to discriminate against workers. For instance, through certain workplace wellness programs, an employer could learn of a disability, a health condition, or genetic condition that is otherwise protected by anti-discrimination law. Too often, employers and technology vendors are not transparent about the design and use of digital tools, posing challenges for workers seeking redress for workplace discrimination. Simply put, without transparent and responsible design, digital tools can further perpetuate and even exacerbate long-held biases that have led to workplace disparities, particularly for women of color, individuals, individuals with disabilities, women, and older workers. Moreover, digital tools that are opaque in their design and operation cannot be held accountable. As traditional employment relationships shift dramatically in our modern economy, workers' anti-discrimination protections are also in jeopardy. As this committee has established, new technologies have fundamentally restructured the workplace through the rise of gig and platform work. These platforms have provided workers with new opportunities, but many employers have also used new technologies to deny workers basic protections. For example, app-based companies frequently misclassify their employees as independent contractors, depriving them of protections and benefits such as minimum wage and overtime pay. Worker misclassification is not unique to app-based companies. Some app-based companies directly hire their employees, as we learned from a business leader in our first Future of Work hearing. Workers misclassified as independent contractors are also excluded from the majority of federal workplace anti-discrimination laws, including protection under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. These gaps leave workers classified as independent contractors, whether misclassified or not, with few options to challenge discrimination. We have the responsibility on this committee to work with federal agencies and the business community to strengthen workplace protections in the face of changing technology. And this should include the right to be free from workplace discrimination and the right to be hired based on qualifications rather than age, identity, or zip code. We must compel employers and technology vendors to be transparent and accountable for new workplace technologies. We must invest in our key defenses against employment discrimination and empower the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to address emerging forms of digital discrimination, and we must identify and close the gaps in our nation's laws that leave workers vulnerable to misclassification, discrimination, and harassment on the job. I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and Upturn, and a recent report on hiring algorithms, equity, and bias from Upturn into the record. No, without objection, so ordered. I look forward to our discussion today, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Comer, for an opening statement. And I do want to note, I went long, so if you want to take a little extra time, feel free.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Today we're here to discuss how technological advancements are affecting workers. New technologies continue to increase efficiency, reduce costs for employers in recruiting and hiring, and lead to quicker job placements and enhanced job opportunities. In a statement to this committee, the HR Policy Association noted, quote, in a recent survey, 71% of staffing firms believe artificial intelligence will eliminate human bias from the recruitment process, unquote. So not only can employers utilize new technologies to eliminate employment bias, but they can also be used to decrease time and the cost of doing business. Technology has also driven the sharing economy, which has created substantial opportunities for workers and job creators who are seeking flexible workforce arrangements so they can better compete in our ever-changing economy. Workers are seeking out the benefits and flexibility these arrangements provide as they recognize how significantly they can improve their quality of life as well as their families. This is a growing trend among American workers and job seekers that should be encouraged, not impeded. Many businesses who also value flexibility and productivity are turning to independent contractors. The use of independent contractors makes sense for job creators looking to obtain high-quality services, for workers who want to offer their skills on their own terms, and for consumers who benefit from a reduction in the cost of goods and services. Simply put, online platforms and other emerging technologies have given American workers more control, flexibility, and opportunity in the workplace than they have previously had. Regardless of technological advancements, every American should have the opportunity to achieve success in the workplace free from discrimination. This is why there are important protections built into federal law to prevent workplace discrimination. These protections are broadly written and continue to apply to new and emerging technologies. These laws protect individuals from employment discrimination based on age, color, disability, genetic information, national origin, race, religion, or sex. Workers in the sharing economy are also protected. For example, the Fair Labor Standards Act has strong remedies in place for employers who incorrectly classify workers and violate minimum wage and overtime requirements. All workers should be paid in full for their work. That is why committee Republicans support enforcement of the FLSA. We shouldn't penalize Americans who work for themselves or the companies that do businesses with them. Instead, we should applaud these Americans for their entrepreneurial spirit. Our nation's laws were written so that they can be and are applied to employers' use of technologies in ways that protect workers. Additionally, it should go without saying that the overwhelming majority of businesses follow the law and want to do what is expected of them. Bottom line, workers, job creators, and the U.S. economy are all benefiting from today's technological advancements. Madam Chair, before we hear from our witnesses, I need to take a moment to point out the hypocrisy of today's hearing. My Democrat colleagues want to talk about protecting workers' rights while they simultaneously push radical legislation that will undermine the rights of workers. H.R. 2474, the PRO Act, which we expect will be on the House floor for a vote tomorrow, is written to bail out the failing labor union business model that is being widely rejected by American workers. This radical legislation would penalize entrepreneurship by creating an expansive, one-size-fits-all definition of an employee, which will increase costs for business owners as well as consumers, while limiting work opportunities for individuals who desire flexibility. Instead, we should champion reforms that expand opportunities for flexibility, innovation, and entrepreneurship to give workers and job seekers opportunities to compete successfully in the modern economy. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to their testimony. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Comer. I know we'll be having the PROACT debate on the floor as well as in this committee, but now we're going to focus on the topic at hand. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, February 18th, 2020. I will now introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses, and I will introduce each witness before we begin questions. First, Ms. Jenny Yang served as the chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from September of 2014 to January of 2017, and as vice chair and a member of the commission from 2013 to 2018. Under her leadership, the commission launched the Select Task Force on the Study of Harassment in the Workplace to identify innovative solutions to prevent harassment at work, and she led efforts to strengthen the EEOC's annual data collection to include employer reporting of pay data. Next, we have Dr. Iforma Ajuwe. She's an assistant professor of labor and employment law in the Law, Labor Relations, and History Department of Cornell University's Industrial and Labor Relations School and an associate faculty member at Cornell Law School. She is also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School and an affiliate of the Center for the Study of Inequality at Cornell University. She is a 2019 recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award and a 2018 recipient of the Derek A. Bell Award from the Association of American Law Schools. Dr. Ajunwa's research interests are at the intersection of law and technology with a particular focus on the ethical governance of workplace technologies. And at the discretion of the chair, I do want to mention that Derek Bell was my law school dean when I went to law school at the University of Oregon, so it is an honor that you are here with that award, the Distinguished Award. Ms. Esther Lander is a partner at Aiken Gump Strauss Hauerfeld LLP, Washington, D.C., where she focuses on complex employment litigation, high-stakes internal and government investigations, and client counseling. She previously served as the principal deputy chief of the Employment Litigation Section within the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. Mr. Peter Romer Friedman is a principal at Gupta Wessler PLLC in Washington, D.C., where he heads the firm's new civil rights and class actions practice. He maintains a dynamic and innovative civil rights docket with an emphasis on employment discrimination and benefits, fair housing, credit discrimination, and constitutional rights. His civil rights cases often arise at the cutting edge of the law and focus on solving both entrenched and emerging problems with novel approaches. We appreciate all of the witnesses for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements, and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Let me remind the witnesses as well that pursuant to Title 18 of U.S. Code Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on your microphone in front of you so it will turn on and the members can hear you. As you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired and we ask you to wrap up. We will let the entire panel make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, again, please remember to turn your microphone on. And I first recognize Ms. Yang for your testimony.
Thank you. Chair Bonamici, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm a fellow at the Urban Institute, but the views expressed are my own and shouldn't be attributed to Urban, its trustees, or funders. I'd like to start by sharing a story of Kyle Bem, a bright college engineering student who applied for an hourly job at Kroger. He had held similar positions in the past, yet after taking a personality assessment, he was scored red and rejected. Kyle had earlier been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, so personality questions such as whether he experienced mood changes led many major retailers to reject him. Sadly, Kyle is no longer with us today, but his father, Roland, continues to advocate to ensure people with disabilities are not systematically excluded by hiring assessments. A new generation of AI-driven screens are transforming the lives of America's workers with profound implications for civil rights. To ensure an equitable future, we must ask the question, who is at risk of being screened out? Otherwise, workers who fall outside of a set profile could be unemployable for reasons that aren't truly job-related. Today, I will focus on two areas. First, I will discuss algorithmic hiring and discrimination. Second, I'll address new tech-driven civil rights concerns for workers on the job. Let's take a look at the stages of the hiring process through this hiring funnel. In the sourcing stage, employers recruit applicants. In the screening phase, employers assess applicants' abilities. In the interviewing stage, many employers now use video interviews to evaluate candidates. Finally, employers select candidates and set pay. In each stage, complex algorithms inform decisions. Today, I will focus on screening algorithms. Because of the dramatic rise in online applicants, employers are using chatbots, resume screens, online assessments, and web games to automate decisions. Some employers are seeking to increase diversity by measuring abilities rather than relying on proxies, such as elite university degrees. Yet many employers simply attempt to automate their past hiring decisions, which may reflect bias. Algorithmic systems can then replicate existing inequities on a massive scale. Bias can enter systems in several ways. First, bias may be introduced in the data used to train algorithms. Amazon's effort to build a resume screen highlights this challenge. The computer models trained on resumes submitted over 10 years, which were mostly from men. The model then learned to prefer males and penalize women's resumes containing words such as women's chess club or all women's colleges. Second, bias may arise from the variables considered. Models may learn to utilize proxies for protected characteristics. For example, zip codes can be a proxy for race. The selection of variables can reflect the blind spots of developers, a particularly acute concern given the lack of diversity in the field. Finally, humans may misuse the predictions and place undue weight on them. To ensure safeguards, I share 3 strategies for consideration. First, an update to the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures of 1978 would incorporate the latest scientific understanding into unified government principles. Second, a third-party auditing system would promote accountability while having flexibility to evolve with technology and protect intellectual property. Third, a workers' Bill of Rights for algorithmic decisions would ensure that individuals understand how decisions are made and have a process to challenge them. Next, I'd like to turn to new tech-driven civil rights concerns for workers on the job. One significant concern is that increased surveillance and tracking of workers' interactions throughout the day may deter workers from coming together to raise civil rights concerns for fear of retaliation. Another concern is that a growing reliance on customer ratings by tech platforms and automated performance systems can introduce harmful and unchecked bias. Finally, online platforms have disrupted traditional employment relationships, classifying many workers as independent contractors. As non-employees, they aren't protected by most federal anti-discrimination laws. Although Section 1981 prohibits intentional discrimination in contracting based on race and ethnicity, it doesn't prohibit other forms of discrimination such as sexual harassment. States are filling these gaps by providing protections for independent contractors and making it more difficult to misclassify workers. To ensure a future that advances equal opportunity, we need safeguards that create meaningful accountability. The focus cannot remain solely on optimizing processes for employers, but must also consider the impact on workers' dignity and civil rights. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Ajunwa.
Chair Bonamici, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am a labor and employment law professor at Cornell University, and I have been asked to testify today on two topics. The first, employment discrimination and privacy concerns arising from automated hiring, including automated video interviewing. And the second, privacy and discrimination concerns related to the use of workplace wellness programs and electronic workplace surveillance. These technological advancements and their potential for employment discrimination beg for updates to labor and employment law. I identify three major problems with automated hiring. The first, the design features of automated hiring platforms may enable employers to eliminate applicants from protected categories without retaining a record. Second, intellectual property law, which protects automated hiring from scrutiny, could allow discriminatory practices to go undetected. And third, the unrestricted portability of applicant data from automated hiring systems increases the chances of repeated employment discrimination, resulting in algorithmic blackballing. Automated video interviews are the newest trend in automated hiring. With this new technology, candidates' responses are captured on video and then evaluated based on word choice, speech patterns, and facial expressions. When video interviewing systems are trained on white male voices and faces, this disadvantages both racial minorities and white women whose facial expressions and tone of voice might be misinterpreted. Other issues associated with automated hiring include the unregulated collection of applicants' personal data and the black box nature of how such information is used. To date, there are no federal regulations governing the collection, storage, or use of data from automated hiring. To remedy this, I propose three updates to labor and employment law. First is the addition of a third cause of action, the discrimination per se doctrine, to Title VII. Second, the requirement for audits and certification of automated hiring systems. And third, a mandate for data retention and record keeping design features for automated hiring systems. In addition to automated hiring, technology has advanced the capability of employers to monitor their workers through digital surveillance and also employee wellness programs. Beginning with punch card systems, advancing to GPS systems, and most recently, microchips embedded under the skin, invasive workplace surveillance is now a part of life for most Americans. For example, workplace wellness programs have evolved to offer health risk assessments. And despite protections afforded by anti-discrimination laws, employers have started to offer genetic tests to employees. But the introduction of genetic testing to workplace wellness programs contradicts both the letter and the spirit of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. To protect the health privacy of workers, my co-authors and I have proposed two new laws. First, the Employee Privacy Protection Act, the EPA, would ensure that employee monitoring is constrained to the workplace and actual job tasks. The EPA would limit surveillance outside the workplace and would prohibit the monitoring of employees when they are off duty. Second, the Employee Health Information Privacy Act, the EHIPAA, would clarify that health information generated from workplace wellness programs is protected information under existing anti-discrimination and health privacy laws. The EHIPAA would also ensure that data collected from workers could not be sold without the employee's consent. For the future of work, the primary concern should be whether workers will enjoy equal opportunity for employment and also thrive in workplaces that respect human privacy. Governmental action is necessary to protect workers from being forced to trade their dignity in the employment bargain. I thank the committee for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Lander for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Bonamici, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the subcommittee for allowing me to appear before you today. I'm a partner at the law firm Aiken Gump in the firm's Labor and Employment Group here in Washington, D.C. I previously served as the Principal Deputy Chief in the Employment Litigation Section of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and I'm appearing here today in my personal capacity. In my written testimony, I described the many benefits associated with using technology in employee selection procedures. If used correctly, the business case is clear. Employers are able to harness the power of available data to efficiently make sound selection decisions, reduce manual labor, subject candidates to the same objective screening criteria, and eliminate the potential for implicit bias that exists with subjective decision-making. With so many technology-based tools on the market, however, concerns have been raised that AI screening is resulting in unlawful discrimination. To date, there have been few lawsuits challenging AI tools, and there are no published studies to show technology-based selections are more likely to result in discrimination than more traditional paper and pencil tests. With that said, when employers implement technology to make selection decisions, it is important to understand the laws that already exist to protect applicants and candidates from unlawful discrimination. Specifically, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which amended Title VII to make disparate impact discrimination an unlawful employment practice. Under the 1991 Act, any selection procedure that adversely impacts protected groups must be justified by the employer as job-related and consistent with business necessity. To make this showing, employers must document a strong connection between the selection procedure and the job in question, which typically involves a process called testing validation. Courts assess the adequacy of an employer's validation efforts under the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures, which were adopted by the EEOC and other government agencies to assess the lawfulness of selection procedures under Title VII. Although the guidelines were established in 1978, which admittedly was a long time ago, they are well equipped to address the concerns expressed by other witnesses today about AI tools resulting in hiring decisions based on non-job-related correlations that screen out protected groups. First, the guidelines anticipate developments in hiring techniques and tools and make clear that all selection procedures need to be reviewed in light of current understandings, which in itself is a basis to reject validation studies premised on non-job-related correlations. Second, the guidelines direct enforcement agencies to consider whether the selection procedure was carefully developed and is being used in accordance with professional standards. This concept is commonly referred to as competent test design. So for example, if an AI tool has machine learned to disproportionately screen out applicants from a protected group because they do not share the same zip code as successful incumbents, an employer would not be able to show competent test design even if a strong correlation exists between performing successfully on the job and one zip code. Third, the guidelines require that all validation studies include a complete and explicit description of the selection procedure that includes any measures that are being used. This written transparency requirement means that vendors cannot hide behind the so-called black box. A proper validation study that complies with the guidelines must explain what the selection procedure is measuring and then correlate those measures with successful job performance, reduce turnover, or other important job-related behaviors. And finally, regardless of how a selection procedure is validated, the guidelines require an investigation into fairness. This investigation could include taking a deeper look at the selection procedure to see what items, or in the case of AI tools, which screening criteria are causing adverse impact, and to consider removing those criteria and making other modifications that will result in a fair selection procedure. I'd also like to briefly address the gig economy, an area where advances in technology have created opportunities for workers and companies. Workers can take advantage of low costs, flexible hours, and the ability to easily build an independent business. The ease of technology and the volume of workers using it has heightened concerns about worker misclassification. However, there is a body of law that already exists to address this topic, as does a comprehensive remedial scheme for workers who have been misclassified. The remedies for misclassified workers grow even more substantial when recovered on a class-wide basis, which has served as a powerful deterrent against worker misclassification. In closing, technology advances are beneficial to workers, employers, companies, and the economy. As the labor force and businesses adapt to these changes, employment laws are currently in place to ensure that worker rights are protected. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and share my thoughts on the important topics covered by this hearing. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Romer Friedman for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Peter Romer Friedman. I'm a principal at Gupta Wessler, PLLC. I'm the head of the firm's Civil Rights and Class Actions practice. As a civil rights lawyer, I've represented victims of discrimination in jobs, housing, credit, and public accommodations. They've included workers in many industries, service members and veterans, victims of Hurricane Katrina and the foreclosure crisis, as well as farmers and ranchers. Lately, I've focused on combating digital bias. 60 years ago, there were no desktop computers or websites, but we did have entrenched discrimination in the workplace, housing, and public spaces. If you picked up a newspaper in 1960, you'd see classified ads with segregated columns for male and female jobs, job ads that stated explicit preferences based on race, gender, and age. Congress tried to put an end to this biased advertising and recruiting when it enacted Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. Congress knew this discrimination has huge negative consequences. If you announce a job is for men, women are less likely to apply. If you primarily recruit men, mostly men will be hired. For decades, it appeared that these laws were working. Overt discrimination in statements and newspapers disappeared. Most employers stopped openly recruiting based on biased preferences. This all changed, however, when employers decided to harness the power of the internet and social media to recruit workers. Advertising platforms like Facebook enabled employers to discriminate in their job advertising so that they could target job ads only to people of certain races, genders, ages, zip codes, and even political interests. An untold number of employers deployed these very tools to expressly exclude workers from receiving their job ads based on many protected traits. And until recently, when Facebook made changes due to a settlement with my clients, it was possible for employers to exclude people from getting job ads based on thousands of categories unrelated to jobs. For example, an employer could decide not to send their job ads on Facebook to people interested in Christianity, the Republican National Committee, the ACLU, or the AFL-CIO. And just a few years ago, employers could target job ads on Facebook to people interested in heinous things like Hitler, white pride, fascism, rape, and ISIS. There's never been a full public accounting of all the biased ads published on Facebook. But here's what we know from investigative journalism and the investigation of my client, the Communication Workers of America. Hundreds, if not thousands, of employers routinely excluded women and older workers from getting job ads on Facebook. The same bias was common in ads for housing, credit, and other financial services. There have likely been hundreds of millions of incidents of digital bias. Here are a few real-life examples. T-Mobile sent job ads on Facebook targeting people who were only 18 to 38 years old. Amazon sent job ads on Facebook that targeted only people 18 to 50. A leading security installation company called Defenders sent job ads targeting only men 20 to 40. Thankfully, many terrific advocates stepped up to challenge this harmful discrimination. Organizations like the CWA, the ACLU, National Fair Housing Alliance, and my prior law firm, Auditing & Golden. We took Facebook to court and filed EEOC charges against dozens of employers that denied job ads to women or older workers. After years of litigation, Facebook, in March of 2019, agreed to make sweeping changes to its platform to prevent advertisers from denying job, housing, and credit ads based on protected statuses, and Facebook recently implemented those changes. Still, we're very concerned that Facebook's own algorithm may be discriminating based on age and gender when Facebook itself decides which users will receive job ads within an audience the advertiser selected. We're also troubled that dozens of major employers, including Amazon, T-Mobile, and Capital One, are claiming that federal law does not bar them from denying job ads to workers based on a protected status like age. We believe our federal civil rights laws already outlaw this crude digital bias, and recently we've seen the DOJ, EEOC, and HUD agree that it's illegal to deny job or housing ads based on a person's race, gender, or age. But Congress can and should take critical steps to clarify and strengthen federal law to stop digital bias. I've recommended a range of critical steps that Congress can take, including ensuring that tech platforms like Facebook are covered by civil rights laws, clarifying that certain types of digital bias are unlawful, requiring greater disclosure of digital practices and bias, and making sure that the federal public accommodations law applies to online spaces, and ending Section 230C immunity for commercial or paid advertising. In too many areas of our society, the move fast and break things credo of powerful technology leaders like Mark Zuckerberg has turned back the clock by more than half a century. It has upended our civil rights, our civil discourse, and even the most basic facts that our society can agree upon. Technology should not disrupt our civil rights. It shouldn't break equal opportunity. Technology should be a mechanism for making the promise of equal opportunity and integration a reality, especially in the workplace. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to answer any questions.
Thank you so much to each of our witnesses today. Under the committee rule 8A, we'll now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. And I want to say, in light of all the testimony we heard today, I'm sure everyone wishes for more than 5 minutes because we have so many questions. But I will now yield myself 5 minutes. Professor Ajunwa, in your written testimony, you discuss how companies use automated video interviewing that permits the employer to evaluate factors that are not job-related in the interviewing process. Last year, in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Joy Bolamwini, who's the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, testified on some of these issues, and they discussed their experience with facial analysis software failing to detect their dark skin until they put on a white mask, which uncovered both skin type and gender bias in the AI services from companies like Microsoft, IBM, Amazon. So, Professor, what characteristic can employers evaluate when using automated video interviewing? And do individuals typically know these factors being evaluated as they interview?
Thank you for your question, Chair Bonamici. So one of the bigger problems with automated video interviewing is that oftentimes the job applicants don't actually know that they will be evaluated based on their video. They just think that they're sending in a video that will then be viewed by humans, but actually that video is actually being put through algorithms that are evaluating both the facial expressions, tone of voice, even word choice. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you look at how the training of the algorithm is done, oftentimes the training is using a very limited pool of applicants, so it could be all white male applicants, and in which case women who have different tones of voices, or even people who are from other cultures and therefore have different facial expressions can actually be disadvantaged because then their responses can be misinterpreted by the algorithm.
Thank you. Both on this committee and on the Science Committee, we have a lot of conversations about the importance of diversifying the STEM workforce, and I think that is one step in solving this problem, because obviously designing the algorithm, it makes a difference. Mr. Romer-Friedman, in your testimony, you said that job advertisements are often targeted based on categories that are not job-related or proxies, and you described how individuals may be excluded from seeing job ads. Thank you for the actual visual representation. Do you consider excluding an individual from seeing a job ad because their experience exceeds a maximum number of years, or because they attended a women's college, for example? Would those be examples of targeting based on proxies?
Absolutely, Chairman Amici. These are the kinds of things that, without the digital procedures and processes, could be illegal. We see this a lot in the economy for older workers. They're excluded simply because they have too many years of experience or they graduated from college a number of years ago. But we're seeing the same thing accelerated and exacerbated in the digital space. And that's a problem. We think that it clearly violates the law. It not only has a disparate impact, we think you can infer intentional discrimination from these kinds of clear proxies.
And how could Congress best make sure that the employers are not using proxies to discriminate based on sex, age, religion, other categories, protected categories?
As I've recommended in my testimony, Congress could explicitly say that if a job category or if a category for targeting someone or evaluating someone is not directly related to the job or the opportunity, it simply is banned. It would be an unlawful practice in the same way that it's just strictly unlawful, regardless of the intent, to advertise a job that states a preference based on age or race or gender.
Thank you, Ms. Yang. You're former chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. What additional resources could Congress provide to the EEOC, the Commission on Civil Rights, and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs to adequately address the problems that were described today with algorithmic bias and digital discrimination in hiring?
Thank you, Chair Bonamici, for that question. The government plays a particularly important role in rooting out hiring discrimination because individuals typically don't know why they weren't hired. So the EEOC made it a priority to look at recruiting and hiring discrimination, and the agency has authority to open charges on their own investigation, even where an individual may not have enough information. So right now, under our current law, the federal government plays an incredibly important role in investigating concerns about hiring screens, and the agencies need more resources. They need to be able to hire computer scientists and data scientists who understand how these systems work. We had initially started a task force over 4 years ago, back when I was at the EOC. We had Professor Ajunwa testify and help us learn about these issues. But we didn't have the capacity on staff to really fully understand how to evaluate these systems, to understand how the uniform guidelines really need to be updated, and having that technical know-how within the agency would be incredibly valuable.
Thank you so much. I yield back and recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Fox from North Carolina, for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Lander, the federal laws prohibiting employment discrimination do not explicitly address the technologies we're discussing today. In your opinion, though, are these statutes readily applied in the modern workplace and to employers' use of search engines, algorithms, and AI in the recruitment and screening process? Do you see gaps in these laws, or do you believe these laws are more than broad enough to cover new technologies?
Thank you for that question. As a practitioner in this area who actually has counseled clients and reviewed some of the tools that we're talking about today, I have not had any difficulty applying the uniform guidelines as written to assess these tools and to provide feedback to both my clients and the vendors who are selling them regarding ways in which they should be modified or enhanced to ensure non-discriminatory selections. So to answer your question, yes, I do believe that it is not difficult to apply the uniform guidelines as they're currently written to address the concerns that are being raised by the panel today with regard to the technology tools that are on the market.
Thank you, Ms. Lander. Ms. Lander, what are the upsides for business owners of using new technologies in recruiting and screening job candidates from the perspective of complying with non-discrimination laws? In what ways are these technologies superior to other forms of job recruitment and screening when it comes to complying with the federal laws prohibiting discrimination?
Well, in this current climate that we're in, the volume of resumes and applications that are submitted, it's quite different than the day and age where somebody had to walk in and fill out a paper application. Employers are being bombarded with, thousands of applications sometimes when they have an opening, and in its simplest form, AI tools are capable of simply scanning those applications or resumes simply to screen out those who don't even have the minimum qualifications for the job. which saves a substantial amount of manpower and time in trying to do that with a person. To answer your question, though, about how these tools can help reduce discrimination, when done correctly, these tools eliminate the risk of implicit bias in decision-making, because when the criteria that they're screening for are job-related, the entire screen is objective and is not susceptible to what somebody might believe when they see a particular name or they look at somebody and see a particular race or gender.
Thank you. Ms. Lander, you discussed in your written testimony the uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures jointly written by the EEOC, the Civil Service Commission, Department of Labor, and the Department of Justice, and provide guidance for the employers. And obviously, you've mentioned those in your comments now. Based on your experience, do the guidelines apply to the algorithms and AI that many employers are using? That's somewhat repetitious to my first question. And do the guidelines provide useful information and best practices for employers?
They do. Some of the tools that we're discussing are recruiting tools, and some are hiring or selection tools. So the guidelines are aimed at any sort of hiring test or selection device that makes decisions, that allows people to proceed in the hiring process. So when it comes to recruiting, there is a difference between sourcing, which is efforts to expand your pool of eligible candidates or applicants that meet your the qualifications for the job. And so some of these tools are being used to simply to expand and enhance traditional forms of recruiting. And if people aren't being excluded, if it's not an exclusive method of recruiting or the sole method of recruiting, then arguably adverse impact is not going to be an issue. And so in that case, if there is no adverse impact, the guidelines don't come into play.
Quick question. If an employer wrongly classifies an employee as an independent contractor, isn't there significant potential liability for the employer, including back pay and liquidated damages under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which provides substantial incentives not to classify workers incorrectly?
Yes, that's correct. Not only is back pay and liquidated damages available, for willful violations, the statute of limitations goes back 3 years. And when the class action activity in this space has been quite active, and it has actually changed behavior, and a lot of employers and companies and workers are all quite aware of the issues involved with misclassification, and rights are being protected and asserted on a regular basis through the courts.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence.
I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Scott from Virginia, for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Ajuniwan, several of you have mentioned, if a women's college gets mentioned, that could have a negative effect. Who decides what instructions are given to create the algorithm, and what happens when you get some kind of hit? Who actually designs it?
Thank you very much for your question. I guess the question is who comes up with the criteria used for programming the algorithm. And oftentimes, algorithms are programmed by vendors who then sell them to employers. But also, employers can have algorithms that I call bespoke, meaning that these algorithms are created specifically for that employer. So this, of course, can change the liability, whether the algorithm has been created by the vendor or specifically created at the behest of the employer. So I guess my focus today is really the first scenario, when the algorithm is being created by a vendor and the employer perhaps does not know exactly what has gone into the algorithm and also how it has been trained. So really my advocacy today is really for both the auditing and certification of automated hiring systems before they are deployed, before they can actually be used in the workplace. Because I do believe that, as other witnesses have stated, if automated hiring is used properly or correctly, they could be helpful. The problem is they currently are not, right? The problem is that there are currently no regulations to actually ensure that they are being used correctly and appropriately.
Well, once you have, once it's designed with the discrimination kind of embedded, if the employer bought it from a vendor, would they be immunized from any kind of intentional discrimination?
So that is a gray area. That's a gray area in terms of the law, because one thing that Title VII requires is intent, and other than intent, then the showing of disparate impact. And both things can be hard to prove if the automated hiring system is coming from a vendor, because first you can argue perhaps there's no intent on the side of the employer, but then there's also the issue of even establishing disparate impact, because you would need statistical proof, and the automated hiring is the automated hiring system might have been designed not to retain all the record that you need for the.
Well,
that
how does the
proof.
employer know? He buys this little algorithm thing and uses it. Turns out it's screening people. How would he know?
He wouldn't. So that is why I am advocating for an audit requirement for employers who do then buy automated hiring systems or use automated hiring systems.
Thank you. Ms. Yang, the ranking member brought up independent contractors. If you are an independent contractor, you're not protected under the employer-employee, Title VII, ADA, and others. But you would be protected under Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, where you can't discriminate. Are there limitations in Section 1981 in terms of pursuing discrimination claims if you are an independent contractor?
Yes, federal law provides very limited protections for independent contractors. Under Section 1981, the claims must prove intentional discrimination, which can be very difficult to show in the case of algorithmic bias. In addition, it only covers race and also ethnicity discrimination, but not other bases, right? So it wouldn't cover sexual harassment, age discrimination, disability-based discrimination. And our federal anti-discrimination laws contemplate that true independent contractors will have the bargaining power, that they don't need to be protected against discrimination. But the way in which many companies are misclassifying independent contractors today means that many individuals do not truly have bargaining power, and they need the protection of our anti-discrimination laws.
Thank you. Madam Chair, you're back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I now recognize Ms. Stefanik from New York for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici. Ms. Lander, I appreciate that you raised how contractual or gig arrangements can be beneficial to workers, as I believe this perspective needs to be central in our discussions on worker classification. Millennials, as you know, now comprise the largest cohort in the U.S. labor force, and these workers place a higher value on the flexibility and fulfillment that can exist outside the rigid constraints of traditional employment. For years, independent contracting has sparked entrepreneurship and provided an important source of income and flexibility to millions of Americans, including students, veterans, and single parents. In your testimony, you mentioned how there are various legal test courts and government agencies apply to distinguish employees from independent contractors. I've heard from employers, particularly small business owners, that this inconsistency between various agencies has muddied the line on worker classification and really created compliance challenges. Do you believe that harmonizing the legal test across federal agencies would help draw a clearer, bright line on the issue of worker classification and help workers as well as business owners know when misclassification has indeed occurred?
Yes, I do think that that would actually make life a lot easier for employers. However, the problem is that the definition of employee differs from statute to statute. And so, unfortunately, what that means is when courts are interpreting whether a particular civil rights or labor law applies, they have to look at the statutory text and apply it. So as easy as it would be to have a uniform definition, if you're going to be honest to the statutes that involve workers, you can't have a uniform definition across all of the agencies.
So how would you address that then? If there's a uniform definition legislation, which I've worked on, what would we need to do in addition to that?
Well, I'm not a lawmaker, so I can't really answer that question.
Great. Well, your perspective is important on that. I'd like to follow up on that issue to make sure that we get this right. And very briefly, what would happen, what would be the impact of bringing California's ABC test nationwide? And would it allow workers who value freedom and flexibility the choice to maintain their status as independent contractors?
My understanding of the California test is that it moves away from the traditional right to control, which is a critical element in all of the independent contractor analyses under the various laws, and talks about the essence of the business. And so if a worker is engaging in services that is the essence of the company's business, and I don't know if I'm wording that exactly right, then he or she can't be an independent contractor. And that would essentially completely change the entire working dynamic for not just the gig economy, which has been a tremendous boom, and not only for companies that have been able to expand their reach where they otherwise couldn't, but it's also been wonderful for, as you described in your opening remarks, for individuals who need the flexibility to work different schedules and seasonally and things of that sort.
Thank you. You know, as we discuss this issue, I think it's really important that we channel these technological and entrepreneurial opportunities for young people and members of the non-traditional workforce, people that maybe are augmenting their full-time job, people that, as they're aging, want to earn some money on the side. You know, there's lots of benefits to this gig economy, and we have to remember it's totally voluntary by individuals who seek out those opportunities. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I now recognize Dr. Schreier for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here. I really enjoyed reading your testimonies and hearing you today, and it is so interesting to think about, really, there's a rabbit hole that you can go down when you start thinking about how every question you ask or every parameter you put in an algorithm can lead down the line to some sort of discrimination. And I think that this was all developed for efficiency and to cast like a broader net, but a more specific net. But in doing that with so many of the things you talked about, like age or even look-alike that looks at a current workforce, has led to discrimination inadvertently. And so I represent part of Washington State, and they just had a Future of Work task force and released a report in December talking about automation in the workplace and how AI will change the way we work, but it barely touched on this topic of algorithmic discrimination and how that leads to people even finding out about jobs or being eligible for jobs. And so, Ms. Lander, you talked about kind of a look back. You know, once a system is in place, how do we look at it and see if it's discriminating? And I'm wondering if there's a way to look forward. So this is sort of a question from Ms. Yang, Dr. Ajunwa, about whether there are things that we can do to either fundamentally change the way these algorithms work, or whether we should look in another place and change privacy laws so that the algorithms can't even obtain some of that information, and how you might balance those two.
Well, thank you for that question. I think we have a lot of opportunity to make algorithms work more fairly than they are right now. And it starts with ensuring that the information you're considering is truly job-related. And we talked about the training data. Is it diverse and representative of the full spectrum of people that can perform the job? And then what are the criteria that you're building into the variables? Are you thinking about abstract personality characteristics that maybe have some correlation, but heck of a lot of people would also be able to perform the job, even if that weren't their top personality characteristic? And so it comes back to ensuring that we're really being rigorous about the screen being job-related. And the closer you can tailor what you're selecting for to behaviors on the job, the more you can minimize the risk of screening people out who could perform the job. And I do think many advances in technology now will allow us, if you design the system up front, to document the decisions so that you can explain how they were made, which is necessary under our current laws to ensure accountability. Employers themselves, even if they say, I didn't design it, I didn't know what was in the algorithm, they are nonetheless responsible, and my view is that they absolutely need to understand how these decisions are made. They need to be able to explain them through when the government comes in and asks about the system or in litigation. And I do think we need new laws, both to protect privacy, but also to create the right incentives, because these cases are very expensive to litigate.
I'll get back to kind of a follow-up question. I wanted to give you a chance, Dr. Ajinwa, to give your answer, and then I have a follow-up question about that.
Thank you very much for your question. I do certainly agree that we have to be forward-looking, because being backward-looking is basically taking action after the harm has already been done. And I think we can actually prevent a lot of harms from the onset. And that includes, for example, mandates for the design of these automated hiring systems, which we don't yet have. And you're very right to pinpoint that part of the problem is the way that we handle privacy, especially privacy of workers in the United States. And that part of the problem is thinking through what sort of information is actually being pulled into the system of automated hiring.
And it's all out there. Can I just quickly, in the interest of time, my next part was about, you had said, are these issues kind of pertinent to the job? And so a few years ago, Google had a project called Aristotle, and they found out that what really mattered was not so much your engineering degree, but how well you worked with others. Right. And so they kind of lifted up characteristics like a team leader or a club leader or being on a sports team. But even that then chooses for perhaps competitive people, or people who always want to be the star of the show, and might not really lead to the best workplace. I wondered if you could just comment about that, because it is job-related, but it could have inadvertent outcomes.
The challenge is that you may be testing only on your current workforce, right? So you will be replicating that current model. I think algorithmic systems can help us identify bias within broader systems. We might think confidence expressed in resumes as words like executed will mean you're going to perform well. In fact, more men use those words. And in fact, that might not mean you can perform well, right? Confidence doesn't always equal competence. And I think the more we can use these kinds of technology systems to help identify where some of the bias is within processes, then we can actually start to break down some of the historic bias.
And I would add that, having actual record-keeping mandates would aid in this endeavor, right? So to be able to see, what are the people that are actually applying, what are the people that are getting selected, but then also checking that against the wider pool that's out there. So, somebody mentioned non-traditional workforce. So, for example, people who have gaps in employment are oftentimes excluded algorithmically by automated hiring systems. And this can negatively impact women who are often called upon to be caregivers. It can also impact formerly incarcerated citizens who have been rehabilitated and who are trying to reenter the workforce. It can impact veterans. So I really think, having a proactive approach to ensure that there's proper record keeping for automated hiring systems and also proper auditing of automated hiring systems will really be a boon for employers, not just employees.
We're going to move on to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Comer from Kentucky, for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. Ms. Lander, in the modern economy, job recruitment is migrating online. Based on your experience, what have job seekers and employers gained from the use of online platforms when it comes to finding and filling jobs?
The ability to scan the internet to find opportunities for work is a tremendous gain for workers. I can remember back when I was job hunting and had to look in the newspaper at classified ads. So it's a completely different world that we live in today.
Ms. Lander, under current law, if an employer is using technology to screen job applicants that has a negative impact on a protected class, the employer may need to demonstrate the screening criteria is job-related and consistent with the business necessity. What goes into conducting this analysis, and would the employer have to demonstrate a strong connection between the screening criteria and the job that the employer is trying to fill?
Yes, it's the uniform guidelines process for validating a selection device is extremely rigorous. The two most common ways are content validity and criterion validity. Content validity is less likely to apply to the kinds of tools that we're discussing because content validity is typically the content of the test or selection device matches the content of the job, like a pilot simulator or a typing test. Here we're talking about devices that screen for either minimum qualifications or particular personality characteristics, and those are typically justified by criterion validity, which is a rigorous statistical process of matching performance data with performance on the selection device.
So what are some best practices for an employer when it's considering using an online platform or a vendor that employs AI to find suitable job candidates?
As Ms. Yang said, the employer can't get off the hook simply by saying that the employer relied on the vendor. So employers are responsible for knowing how they are screening their candidates. And so any employer that is thinking of using a tool that uses AI or any other sort of technology to screen candidates should be insisting upon seeing the vendor's adverse impact studies as well as the validation work that has been done, and to understand what kind of screening criteria is being used to screen their candidates.
Okay, let me ask you this one last question. If an employee is incorrectly classified as an independent contractor, wouldn't this worker retain all the legal protections of an employee, including the protections of our current civil rights law?
Yes, misclassified workers who are actually employees are protected by all of the employment laws.
Right. And I want to ask Mr. Romer Friedman, you mentioned Facebook in your opening testimony, and Facebook gets a lot of criticism, bipartisan criticism here in Congress. What can Facebook and what should Facebook do differently with respect to this subject we're talking about here today?
Sure. Thank you, Ranking Member Comer. So we've already made a lot of progress lately with Facebook. They've created a special portal for job, housing, and credit ads where you don't have, at this point in time, most of these demographics as selection options to target or exclude, and that's great, and we applaud them for doing that. At the same time, as I mentioned in my testimony, Facebook has to decide who will see what ad, right? So let's say I want to send an ad to everyone here in District of Columbia, but I only buy 10,000 impressions, right? 10,000 people are going to see the ad. Facebook's got to decide who's going to see those ads. And we allege, and we're going to get this hopefully in discovery and litigation, that age and gender are being used. And a group called Upturn has done a study showing that there are racial and gender impacts, so that even if the employer doesn't want to discriminate, by relying on the ad delivery algorithm of Facebook, it may be doing just that and even worse than what was going on for years in the first place, where the employer was expressly excluding certain groups. And so, as you said, and I completely agree with this, most businesses want to follow the law, they want to comply. Right. And that's where I disagree with Ms. Lander, that creating greater clarity in the law always helps compliance and reduces litigation. I think that's, everyone can agree that those are good things. Oftentimes you do that in regulations that the EOC can issue, but Congress can do that too, and I think the laws that Congress enacts express the values of this Congress. So for example, one very basic thing is Amazon says it has a right to send job ads to younger people and not send to older people as long as they put the job ad on their website. That's something where they say there's an ambiguity in the law. Congress could step right in there and make it clear you can't use race, gender, age, disability, veteran status, political status, for example, to exclude people from getting recruited or getting job ads, simply put.
Madam Chair, I have to throw this statistic in here. My congressional district, according to a recent poll, they polled all the congressional districts on Facebook usage. 84% Mine was the second highest in Congress. 84% of the adults in my congressional district get on Facebook at least once a day. So I represent a Facebook district, so we're always trying to.
Mr. Comer. You made
That's
me
right.
want to look at where mine is and everybody else's. It's really interesting. Next, we recognize Ms. Lee from Nevada for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. This has been really an interesting topic to think about all the iterations of what can be, what we view as helping us in this modern day to actually promoting discrimination that we have not thought about. I'm going to turn to older Americans because this body passed the Protecting Older Americans Against Discrimination Act last month with bipartisan support, which restores the ability of older Americans to apply the so-called mixed motive framework, which was afforded to protect other classes of individuals under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to claims of age discrimination. So in light of the new challenges that we're facing in the digital age, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Romer Friedman, you touched upon this a little bit in your last answer. Are there other actions that we should be taking to ensure that older workers have the same protections as other protected classes?
That's a great question. And I think my former colleague, David Lopez, who was the general counsel of the EEOC during the Obama administration, has pointed out to me many times that age discrimination has become so normative and so kind of baked into our society that people don't even think it's illegal, right? So we have to, I think, treat it very seriously. To that end, mixed motive is so important to protect because in this algorithmic bias, digital discrimination discussion, companies will say, well, age was just one of hundreds of factors that could have influenced that decision. Of course, then it's very difficult to piece together how age was used. You shouldn't have to show that age was more determinative in a decision than you would have to for gender or race, but that's the case right now. I think one thing that could be done is making clear that the Age Discrimination Employment Act applies to applicants for disparate impact claims. Right? 2 courts of appeals have held that if you want to bring a disparate impact claim, you can only do it as an employee under the ADEA. You can't do it as an applicant, and that's the whole purpose of the ADA to allow older people to get hired. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that things like companies not being able to screen out when they're recruiting based on the date of graduation or the years of experience and just completely take that person out of the picture digitally. Those are kinds of things that need to be implemented right away.
Thank you. Thank you. As we talked about this, and we deal with this a lot in Congress, is that new technologies are far outpacing our ability to focus on regulating. And certainly that's what we're seeing here today. So as we look at, I'd like to just open this up to all of you, looking down the road, are there potential future developments in workplace or hiring technologies beyond the ones we've talked about today that particularly concern you when it comes to protecting workers' rights from employment discrimination? I'll start with you, Ms. Yang.
Thank you for that question. I am concerned about the increasing worker surveillance and monitoring. Many workers now are tracked all throughout the day. There are productivity metrics that can sometimes be so aggressive that they can interfere with a pregnant woman's ability to go to the bathroom, prayer time, all kinds of civil rights concerns, but also just the simple tracking of people throughout the day may really deter workers from coming together and raising concerns. So I do have concerns about that. And I did want to add one other point about the age discrimination. Older workers are disproportionately represented in independent contractor positions. And so it's especially important that even properly classified independent contractors have anti-discrimination protections, right? If somebody said, well, I'm not going to hire you just because you're old, like right now you have no protections against that. And I think that's something that needs to change as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. First, in response to your concern for older workers, I do want to note that I have seen in my research more discriminations against older workers in terms of their ability to participate in a sort of a digital workplace. So people will use words like digital native to really exclude older workers. So that's something of concern. I also wanted to point out that workplace surveillance is actually something that is on the rise. As I mentioned, the microchips that are being embedded under the skin, but also I see workplace wellness programs as a site of workplace surveillance. For example, now with the sort of a trend or introduction of genetic testing as part of workplace wellness programs, that really raises the question of increased, health discrimination or increased discrimination against people with disabilities, whether real or imagined, because genetic testing is actually just telling you the propensity for disease, but employers might look at it as actually determinative when it's really not. So I think that's a huge concern and something we should really, act against.
Great, thank you. All right, my time has expired. Thank you.
We now recognize Mr. Takano, a member of the full committee from California, for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici, for this very important hearing. As the workforce is changing and we transition to a society more dependent on technology, it's extremely important that we understand how these tools will impact the workforce. Currently, there is a lack of transparency. And without knowing the algorithm behind the program, we have no way of knowing if these tools will remove or reinforce bias. Professor Junwa, as companies are looking to ensure that they remove bias and are mitigating against disparate impact, they would need to know what protected classes potential employees belong to. We know that the more sensitive the information is, information such as sexual orientation or disability status, the less likely a candidate will disclose this information. So my first question is, if companies are unable to obtain this sensitive information from candidates, how can and should they mitigate bias?
So that's an excellent question. Of course, you can't compel applicants to release information that's protected information. However, employers can do analysis after the fact to see if there is indeed a disparate impact based on looking at, for example, this is after the fact, not during the employment decision, just to look at the categories of people that have applied versus the categories of people that were hired. And this can then help them take steps in the future, perhaps to broaden their advertisement pool to attract more people from protected categories if they are lacking those types of people.
A post-hiring review. Ms. Yang, while many companies or vendors will claim that they are complying with the EEOC regulations, we know that many do not because they currently operate in a gray area. Does the EEOC have the ability to regulate the companies and vendors that are contracted by employers to conduct hiring?
That's a very important question. The EEOC does have an important role to play. The agency has sub-regulatory authority under statutes like Title VII and can provide guidance, which is, the uniform guidelines is one form of guidance on how the agency believes vendors should validate hiring screens. So certainly the agency could provide more up-to-date guidance on some of the difficult issues where there are gray areas. A lot of people say, are correlations sufficient to demonstrate validity? I don't believe they are. It would be helpful for the agency to make that clear and explain why.
What recourse, if any, does the EEOC have to hold these companies accountable in the gray area?
Well, during the course of an investigation, I mentioned earlier, the EEOC has the authority to open its own investigation on a commissioner's charge or directed investigation, depending on the statute. So even if an individual doesn't have enough information to come forward, but the EEOC learns of a problem, it can open an investigation. If it finds a problem, it can actually litigate it to enforce the law. But the challenge is having enough information to know where the problems are because, as you mentioned, there is a very big gap in knowledge because of the lack of transparency about how many of these systems work.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Professor Junwa, we know that auditing the algorithm and the code can help us understand if the code is biased. But what kind of auditing should be done, and should it be the responsibility of the EEOC to do this?
Thank you very much for your question. So the question of how the audits of automated hiring systems should be completed or performed is one that I address in my 2 law review articles, The Paradox of Automation as Anti-Bias Intervention and Automated Employment Discrimination. I don't come down on one side whether it has to be a governmental agency or it can be a third-party agency similar to, for example, LEED, which certifies green buildings. So, of course, there's some utility in having it be a governmental agency, but also there's also the recognition of scarce resources.
So maybe not government, but what kind of auditing should be done?
So the kinds of auditing that should be done should be one that's done with essentially an interdisciplinary team. So it should include lawyers, labor and employment lawyers. It should include data scientists who are trained to write code and to understand how machine learning codes work. It should include people who are versed in diversity research in terms of creating a diverse work pool. So it should be an interdisciplinary team.
Well, thank you. Madam Chair, while we should not fear technology and the wonders of using it to increase productivity and efficiency, we cannot move toward a society where everything from employment to housing are guided by systems that are largely unchecked. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. And finally, last but not least, we will recognize Ms. Blunt Rochester from Delaware for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for this very important hearing, and thank you to the panelists. I had the opportunity last month, about 2 months ago, to start a Future Work Caucus here in the Congress, a bipartisan Future Work Caucus. And what you have shared today really highlights the clarion call for all members of Congress to be engaged in these discussions. To me, it appears that technology has really outpaced policy and the people. And so your participation here today is really important. And there are so many topics. I wish I could have everybody's time that's not sitting here because there are issues like language barriers that we haven't talked about. The diversity of those people doing the design work and making sure that those algorithms are working, and even returning citizens. I have a criminal justice bill called Clean Slate that deals with people who are coming out of prison, but therefore are having challenges getting to work. And I want to start off by finalizing Ms. Lee's question, because you two didn't get it, Ms. Landers or Mr. Romer Friedman didn't get a chance to answer the question about your one concern, your big concern. And then I want to ask the whole panel, if there was one thing Congress could do right now, what would it be? So if I could start with Ms. Landers, and I have 3 minutes and 40 seconds.
So I'll be quick. The thing that occurred to me is that we're really moving in a really positive direction in terms of teleworking and worker flexibility. However, there are a lot of laws, like for example in California and even under the FLSA, that put such restrictions on the employer and having to monitor very carefully
So laws
individual work time, that they're reluctant to allow people the flexibility to telework. And so I think that's a growing area because the generation that's coming up after me really enjoys working from Starbucks.
So telework. Thank you. Mr. Romer Friedman.
Thanks. If I could just say, this whole line of argument that independent contracting gives flexibility and having an employer-employee relationship does not is a farce. You can do all the flexibility you want through the traditional employer relationship, get all the protections that the New Deal and Great Society and subsequent laws created. To your question, Congresswoman, I think that, we saw a scandal a couple weeks ago with Clearview, that a company essentially collected all photographs from pretty much everyone on the internet who was on social media and created facial recognition, gave that to law enforcement mostly. I think it's concerning to me that we're seeing the millennials and the next generation grow up in a time of social media. I think at some point employers will be able to literally press a button and get every piece of information about someone that's been on the internet forever, which not just could be embarrassing to people, but won't be representative of them. If you point out, someone who's returning from prison, who's paid their debt to society with time, that person may have all that stuff come up in the same way that right now you don't want a criminal record, even if it's not a conviction, to be used for employment. So that's going to be a big issue.
Big issue. Thank you. And Dr. Anjua. in terms of the thing that
So,
Congress
yeah,
can do?
thank you so much for your question. I think really what is urgent for government to do right now is to ensure that automated hiring is regulated. As it stands, there are just no regulations as to what information is collected, how that information is evaluated, and also what even happens to that information, whether the applicant is hired or not. And so governmental action is definitely needed, both to audit and certify the automated hiring system, but also to ensure that all the data that is being collected on applicants is not something that's then used against the applicant in the future.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Yang, or Ms. Yang?
Thank you. I believe a workers' bill of rights is needed so that workers understand how algorithms are making decisions and how that might impact them. Because people like Kyle Bem, he only knew he was screened out because a friend who worked at the company told him. Most people don't know this information, and then the systems don't get to improve from feedback loops about why people were excluded, right? So if people know, you know what, I don't think you're going to accurately transcribe my accent with the type of screen you're using, they can raise that concern and try to make systems better.
Thank you. And I have so many more questions, which I will follow up with many of you afterwards. One question I did have for Dr. Anjua, you mentioned microchips. I was just curious. I was looking for that in the testimony. Could you speak a little bit more on that?
Sure. So thank you for your question. So your question pertained to the use of microchips embedded under the skin as a new, really, I think, a surveillance tool. So many corporations are marketing this as a convenience for employees in terms of helping them to open doors or access sensitive areas. But in my opinion, because these chips are permanently with the employee, they can track the employee wherever that employee is, even off the job. So I do see them as surveillance devices.
Well, my time has run out, but I thank you all for your testimony, and we will be following up with you. And I know data privacy is something that we're doing on my other committee, Energy and Commerce, so look forward to working with you. Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you so much, and I want to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing, preferably in Microsoft Word format. The materials submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member of the committee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame, but please recognize that years from now that link may no longer work. I always like that part. So again, I want to thank the witnesses for their participation today. What we've heard is very valuable, and I think many of us have a lot more questions, and members of the committee may submit those questions. We ask that you please respond in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days to receive those responses. And I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. And they must address the subject matter of the hearing. And I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for his closing statement.
Thank you. Madam Chair, to begin with, I ask unanimous consent to place in the record a statement from HR Policy Association providing views on today's hearing topic.
Without objection.
And I just, again, want to thank the witnesses who came here to testify. This is an issue we're going to hear a lot more about, and we certainly want to be on top of this. I appreciate all the suggestions, and I like to often remind this committee we have a lot of laws already on the books that address most of the subjects and topics that we discuss in this committee, but it's always good to review the issues as they emerge and make sure that if there's anything that we can do in a bipartisan way in Congress to improve the civil rights of workers, then we certainly need to do that, and that's certainly a bipartisan issue. But again, thank you all for being here today, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Comer. And I recognize myself for purpose of making a closing statement. And thank you again to the witnesses for your expertise, which I very much appreciate. I just want to reiterate that what the ranking member said is that we often work on a bipartisan basis, and I certainly think that this is an issue where we could do that. I know, Ms. Lander, you a couple of times said things like done correctly or used properly, and I think those are the key questions of the use of this technology, if it is done correctly and used properly, and that's the if that we're going to be working on solving. Today's hearing exposed how digital hiring, evaluation, and management tools can threaten workplace civil rights protections, and left unchecked, these largely non-transparent technologies can amplify and perpetuate existing biases that intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against workers. Our civil rights enforcement institutions and the laws they enforce have not kept pace with the technologies that employers are using to recruit, screen, interview, and manage workers. And as our modern workplaces continue to change and employers increasingly rely on independent contractors, whether misclassified or not, accountability for violations of workers' basic civil rights can be diffused, and far too often many workers will be excluded from key anti-discrimination protections. So Congress must fulfill its responsibility to preserve and expand workers' civil rights by requiring transparency in the algorithms that are used to recruit, hire, and evaluate workers, preventing employers from stripping workers of their anti-discrimination protections through misclassification, and clarifying, updating, and better enforcing our landmark civil rights laws to meet the challenges workers face in the digital age. Technology has a tremendous amount of promise, but it's the if used properly, if used correctly. Congress has an opportunity to incentivize innovation in workplace technologies that will put workers first and protect and uphold equal employment opportunities. And if we work together, we can shape a future in which businesses can and will continue to innovate, and workers can and will enjoy strong anti-discrimination protections. And I think simply put, the future of work will be what we make it. So thank you again. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.